Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. Chapter 5. How could she have talked that way to Alan? All the way home, Tracy chided herself. Jerk, jerk, jerk. Alan's hurt face kept blipping through her head, as insistent and upsetting as a broken record. And she, Tracy, had made him look so defeated. She shivered in the wintry spring wind. Dead leaves eddied around her feet. She felt as scummy as the plastic butts dotting the freshening grass, or the pieces of white plastic cups caught in the leaf collections under bushes, or the faded flyers that had escaped doorknobs and spent the winter snared in fitzers. We're all kind of scummy, Tracy thought. The wind wasn't as bitterly cold as it had been a month before, but it sang nastily as it ran up Tracy's jacket sleeves and chilled her bones. She felt as if all the elements were picking at her, provoking her. She tried to steel herself against their irritating invasion, but she was rapidly losing hold. When she turned at the corner of Dunton, Tracy was grateful to see the yellow brick bungalow where once she'd been part of an ordinary, intact family. Long ago. At least now there was a comforting grandmother to meet her when she got home. It didn't seem to Tracy that her grandmother was worried enough about Tracy's mother. It wasn't that she didn't care, she just didn't worry enough. Grandma had put a good face on life for so long that the habit was ingrained. It will all come out in the wash, she would say. Or, all's well that ends well. Or, we'll see. Tracy didn't find any of Grandma's nostrums very comforting. Weren't they just a way of staving off inevitable doom? On the other hand, she knew she relieved her own desperation leaning on Grandma. Wasn't she looking forward to her grandmother in the kitchen right now? Everything in its place, the tea kettle singing in anticipation of their afternoon, after-school cup of tea. Something smelling good for supper, and her grandmother saying, "Nothing says lovin' like something from the oven." Deep down, Tracy knew there was a reckoning ahead. It was inevitable. But she wasn't ready for it. Right now she wanted a grandmother at the table, reading one of those innocent paperback romances with a lurid cover. A grandmother who clung to a cup of tea as the answer to all life's troubles. Tracy's feet stopped dragging as she climbed the back steps and looked into the kitchen for the already familiar scene. After a week, Grandma was a fixture along with the good smells in the passageway that called up her presence. Sometimes it was floor wax or pine cleaner that Tracy smelled as she came in after school. On better days, it was chocolate chip cookies or lamb stew. A curious flatness in the air made Tracy a little hesitant about opening the door into the kitchen. Wasn't she silly? She'd done it every day of her life. Well, at least a lot of days of her life. Why not today? She took a firm hold of the handle and swung the door wide. There was no grandmother. No tea kettle boiling, no cupcakes marching across the windowsills, no stew bubbling on the stove. A man was bent over the kitchen table, reading a newspaper by the little braided lamp. Tracy could see the tops of his glasses and the rugged plaid shirt that fit his square shoulders. He didn't look up as Tracy edged into the room. Tracy slowly surveyed the kitchen. Then she looked down the length of the house for a sight of her grandmother. Finally, the man at the table looked up. Tracy said, "Hi, Grandpa," bending to touch cheeks with the strong, stolid figure sitting over the folded newspaper. She waited a second to give him a chance to say how he'd got there, why he'd come, what he was doing at her kitchen table where Grandma was. But he was not about to expand on the puzzle of his presence. What a different pair, Tracy thought, comparing her grandparents. By now, Grandma would have furnished answers to all Tracy's unasked questions and inquired about her day at school. "When did you get here?" Tracy asked, hardly expecting a reply. "My grandfather was a regular old safety deposit box, huddled inside those square shoulders. That square face," she thought. "He's been stuffing things inside for years without ever taking anything out, giving anything out. Everything Grandma's ever said, everything Mum's ever said, everything I've ever said." How can he do that, she asked herself. Then she realised that she'd just tried to do something like that with Alan. But had she been able to hold it all in like Grandpa? No. The dynamite inside her had made her blow up. She'd never heard of that happening to Grandpa. Wouldn't you think there'd be something powerful enough to pinch his reserve, make him act like everyone else once in a while? Tracy had never seen it happen. Didn't look like it was going to happen today. Grandpa filled the space he was taking in the chair, but he didn't spill out into the room. At least his words didn't. She could feel the difference in the air now he'd come. Where was the grandmother she'd been hoping to see at this table? Where was her mother? For that matter, where were her father, her brother? Why couldn't that family she'd taken for granted come back? Her family hadn't been perfect. She'd felt left out, even when there were 4 of them. But she'd had a normal left-out feeling, one she could handle. Tracy was sure there were a lot of kids whose parents weren't especially interested in them. But the parents were there, making oatmeal, replanting African violets, asking how things went at school, even when they weren't acutely interested in the answers. Tracy sat down in the neat little circle of light made by the squat little rattan lamp her mother kept in the centre of the table. "Where's Grandma?" Her grandfather looked up briefly. "At the hospital." "When will she be back?" "Soon, I suppose." "When do you get here, Grandpa?" "Noon." Tracy tried to frame a sentence that her grandfather couldn't answer in one word. Maybe in those cases he didn't reply at all. Maybe she was wasting her time. She considered reaching out to case the refrigerator, but having her grandfather there made Tracy feel awkward. Strange, she mused, how some people can make you feel ill at ease in your own house. Grandma didn't make her feel that way. Even though Grandpa didn't seem to be paying attention to Tracy, she was on guard, expecting criticism. I don't even want to poke in my own fridge, Tracy thought, though everyone knows kids are hungry after school. Keeping an eye on her grandfather, Tracy slid her chair across the floor towards the tempting brown door. Without looking up, her grandfather growled a deep "rumph." He turned a page of his newspaper, and Tracy fled to her room. I'd feel a whole lot better if I had something to munch on, she thought, as she contemplated the pile of books on her floor and the pile of jeans on her bed. For a minute she considered a run to the kitchen for crackers, but she couldn't face her grandfather again without her grandmother to run interference. Tracy needed a buffer between her and her mother's father. "You a guy who needs to read joke books to get some different perspective," Tracy told her grandfather from the privacy of her room. "Maybe I'll get you one for your birthday." She couldn't imagine her grandfather actually laughing out loud, the way Alan did, guffawing, letting his whole body undulate with merriment. She realised her grandfather was like Mary Lincoln, with the same hard lines in his face from a hard life. She wished her grandmother would get home. It was over a week now, and Dr. McIntosh had said that maybe Tracy and her grandmother could visit Tracy's mother after her first week in the hospital. Tracy tried to imagine what it would be like to see her grandmother again. In a way, she'd put her mother out of her life. She'd let Grandma settle into her mother's spot, telling her the day's news. Tracy edited her confidences, of course, because she didn't want Grandma to know that she hadn't talked to Jan in a couple of days, that she'd turned that nice boy Alan off, that she hadn't signed up for the spring bird walk at Crabtree Orchard. How different they are, Tracy thought, comparing her mother and her grandmother. Grandma only lets the good news get through to her, and Mum only let the bad news get through to her. One way they were the same, she could talk with them. With Grandpa she couldn't talk. At least she couldn't think of anything she ever said that got through to him. Her eye was caught by the book Mrs. Embry had lent her. It was upside down on her dresser, next to her picture of her mother. As she pushed herself off the bed to get The Apprenticeship of Abraham Lincoln, Tracy mentally lined up a picture of her grandfather next to the picture of her mother and the picture of Mary Lincoln. "You all need a joke book," she told them severely. "Especially you, Mary Lincoln," she said to the shot of Mary Lincoln when she was young. "Let me see," she continued. "You had blue eyes, reddish-brown hair, and a prunes and prisms face. You were 5 feet 2 inches tall. You had pretty hands, and you gestured gracefully. but people let you have your way too much, right from the beginning. Tracy turned to her mother's picture. Did Grandma give you your way too much? Did Grandpa? She found that hard to believe. What about Grandpa himself? Did he always get his way too much? Tracy thought Grandma let him have his way all the time, but she didn't know if that had always been the case. Whatever had happened to him, he didn't look very happy to Tracy. Happy. Tracy rolled the word around in her head. Who's happy? Was Abraham Lincoln happy when he was a young man? She looked at an early picture of him. Mary Todd, who was the bright, vivacious centre of every social group, had seen presidential possibilities in him. But what about him? When their engagement was temporarily broken off in January 1840, Lincoln was miserable, so miserable he thought he was the most miserable man living. If what I feel was distributed equally to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Tracy paged through the apprenticeship of Abraham Lincoln, feeling more and more sorry for the young lawyer. His habitual melancholy not only suggested he would not make Mary Todd happy, but caused him to wonder whether he was suited to enjoy the married state with anyone, Tracy read. Lincoln was so depressed he became physically ill in the middle of the legislative session at Springfield. How'd they ever get together again, Tracy wondered, just as she got to the page describing the wife of a Sangamo Journal editor who thought Lincoln was brilliant enough for any woman. She brought Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln together and advised them, be friends again. And so they were. Soon after they married. Abraham Lincoln's only preparation was to book a room at the Globe Tavern in Springfield and to buy a gold band inscribed, Love is Eternal. Did they know what they were in for, this melancholy man and this spoiled woman who had aspired to be a First Lady, this great 6'4" tall giant and the plump 5'2" Mary Todd, this Southern belle who revelled in attention, and the backwoods lawyer who read lying on the hearthrug with his feet propped up against the wall? One of Tracy's mother's frequent warnings was against hoping to reform a husband after marriage. Don't ever try that, Tracy, she'd said 100 times. It never works. You've got to accept a person the way he or she is. That way they may change someday. But if you bother them about things, they will just get their back up. Reading Olivia Coolidge's book, Tracy decided that Mary Todd's mother had never shared that good advice. Or at least Mary Todd had never listened if her mother had given it. Because Mary Todd Lincoln set out immediately to improve Abraham Lincoln. She criticized him. She nagged him. She lost her temper. She tried to break his habits of stuffing important papers in his hatband, slumping in his chair and wrinkling his suits. She was dead against him sitting around in his shirt sleeves. Tracy was distracted from Mary Lincoln by voices in the kitchen. Maybe Grandma was back. Stuffing a tissue in her place in the Lincoln book, she rolled off her bed and opened her bedroom door a little. She could hear Grandma describing the doctor. Little thing, but she makes a lot of sense. Tracy sat down in the doorway, leaning against the door jamb. This was more than Grandmother ever told her. Not surprising, she heard, but then Grandma dropped her voice. Tracy edged her way down the hall, trying to catch what was surprising. She couldn't hear Grandpa say anything. Her grandmother's voice was almost placid. She couldn't be too worried. Tracy heard the water begin to boil. She could smell onions cooking. She was close enough now that the overhead kitchen light made an elongated patch of brightness into the dark where she was sitting, hoping to find something out about her mother. "Where's Tracy?" she heard her mother ask. She waited to hear what Grandfather would say. But Grandmother answered her own question. Probably in her room. She's always got her nose stuck in a book these days. She ought to be getting out of the house more. There's no point in that child worrying. Blessings on you. It can't do any good. She needs to put things out of her mind. Momentarily, Tracy listened to the sound of a knife hitting the chopping board. She was about to slide back down the hall when her grandmother took up the thread of her former considerations. Tracy missed the start of the sentence, swivelling back to begin her roomward crawl, but her ears caught something about the jeans. She was afraid of being caught, but this is what she'd come to hear. They're beginning to find out from some studies they've done on the Amish that certain families carry genes that make it more likely that family members who have them will fall into depression. The sound of dishes clanking against the table erased the next few words. Tracy moved closer. Takes some circumstance to push them over. The swinging door Tracy was leaning against swung open. Her grandmother didn't look surprised. "Oh, there you are," she said. "I was just asking your grandfather where you were. Do you know where the rest of those blueberry muffins I made yesterday were? He'd like some with his liver and onions, but I couldn't find them anywhere. Did I ask you to put them in the freezer?" Tracy opened her mouth to ask what Grandma had been saying about her mother, but what was the use? You could tell from her determinedly cheery look that Grandma had already dismissed anything frightening or discouraging that Dr. McIntosh might have said. She was acting as if it was the most normal thing in the world that Grandpa was there, and that she was there, and that Tracy's mother wasn't there. "It's not that I'm not glad you're here," Tracy wanted to say to her grandmother, "but it's awfully hard pretending that this is normal when it isn't, and not knowing what is going to be normal from now on." "Is it always going to be like this?" Tracy wondered. "You and Grandpa cosy in my mother's kitchen, cooking in my mother's wedding revereware, reading under the little rattan lamp my mother bought to make a warm circle in this big kitchen." At some level, Tracy just wanted to scream. Maybe if my mother had screamed, she wouldn't have got so strange. She'd tried to be a good daughter and a good mother, and to go on as if terrible things had not happened to her. But terrible things had happened to her. Dad was gone. Ray was gone. And now Mum was gone because she couldn't face it that Dad and Ray were gone. Then Tracy was frozen by a really scary thought. Could I be next? She wondered. Will I look at Grandma as if she'd put arsenic in the liver and onions? Will they cart me off to 1 West? I could just not eat it, she thought, remembering how her father had always refused to eat his portion of this supper. "I hate liver, liver makes me quiver, liver makes me curl right up and cry, I think I'll die," he'd always quoted. Tracy knew she didn't have the quote exactly right, but it was close enough to make her smile. Grandma noticed the smile and made it an opportunity to gesture Tracy towards the chair across from her grandfather. "At least I'm not worried about being poisoned tonight," Tracy thought. As Grandma would say, be grateful for small favours. To Tracy, sitting down to liver and onions on a sunflower plate, having her wits about her didn't seem a small favour at all. It seemed like a very large favour. She smiled again, gratefully, at her grandmother and cut a small bite of the quivery dinner. Until next time, good night.